Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and in the studio with us, Rebecca Vallas, the Managing Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress, and a host of Talk Poverty Radio, which has been relaunched as the Off-Kilter radio show and podcast. You can find it at facebook.com/Off-Kilter Show. And AmericanProgress.org, of course, is the Center for American Progress. And Rebecca Vallas, you can tweet her at Rebecca Vallas, Vallas. And Rebecca, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tom.
Great having you with us. So the show has been relaunched and renamed. And tell us about the show.
Yeah, so Talk Poverty Radio launched about 2 years ago, and it's been the only show in the nation week after week that covers poverty and inequality as its main focus. It's critically important at a time where not only are more than 13 million Americans living in poverty, but 1 in 3 Americans are struggling to make ends meet. The main reason that we relaunched the show and really our new focus now, it's still poverty, it's still inequality, but we're living in crazy times. I mean, it's not just that we've got 1 in 3 Americans struggling to make ends meet week to week, but we have a president in the White House who promised and campaigned repeatedly to fight for working families. Even he called himself the head of a workers' party during the campaign, but he's already showing through his agenda that not only is he not fighting for the people that he promised to help improve their economic circumstances, he's stabbing them straight in the back, and he's fighting for he's fighting for his millionaire and billionaire friends instead. We've seen this through the budget that we actually expect him to put out tomorrow, which zeroes out programs like legal services, which helps people afford lawyers, zeroes out programs like the Violence Against Women Act grants, which help domestic violence survivors, all to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. That's the real agenda here, no different from his Republican colleagues in Congress.
So this is George Bush and Ronald Reagan all over again.
Well, I think it's worse than that. And I think that that's true not just because of the incredible hateful and divisive agenda that we've seen, attacks on immigrants really just being the tip of the iceberg, but it's also true because we're now watching him and his colleagues in Congress try to remove health insurance from more than 24 million Americans by 2026. That is what the Congressional Budget Office has estimated would be the fallout of repealing the Affordable Care Act. Those are the very people who placed their bets on Donald Trump to try to improve their economic circumstances, and he's singling them out for devastation.
Yeah, and on top of that, he wants to bring back subprime insurance policies.
Basically, every single aspect of his agenda is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He claims to want to save jobs, bring back jobs. Instead, he puts in place a massive federal hiring freeze that actually was a recipe for killing jobs, and jobs that go to people like veterans who make up more than 40% of new federal hires. So the very people that he claimed to protect are the people who are now actually going to be the victims of the American carnage he pledged in his inauguration speech to put an end to.
How you said 1 in 3 Americans is struggling with poverty.
Well, struggling to make ends meet. So it's a little bit more than just the austere kind of federal government definition of poverty, which doesn't capture living paycheck to paycheck, but it's more like living paycheck to paycheck.
Well, and very much. I mean, Mitt Romney's famous 47% of Americans who don't pay income taxes, or federal income taxes anyway, because basically they're living that close to the poverty level. They're barely making it. How does this compare with decade by decade over the last 60, 70, 80 years?
So what we've seen when it comes to the official poverty rate is that looking back to, say, 1967, right, the war on poverty was declared. LBJ put in place important programs that today are really critical anti-poverty programs. The nation's poverty rate today, when you take into account those programs, would be more than twice as high, if not for those kinds of investments in nutrition assistance and housing and Medicaid, the very program that Republicans are trying to dismantle right now. But what you've actually seen is more complicated than just that poverty piece of the pie. So as you were saying, that 1 in 3 figure of Americans struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, that is the direct result of the fact that we have not seen wages keep pace with productivity in this country. We've seen instead the wealthiest and large corporations really capture almost all of the gains that really have been put forth by workers themselves. And so what we see when we see people like President President Trump claim to care about improving workers' circumstances, but then join with his Republican colleagues in Congress in opposing efforts to, say, raise the minimum wage, which at this point has lost a quarter of its real value since those 1960s I was talking about. What you're seeing is them stymie the very policies that would put a dent in that 1 in 3 figure.
Well, and I would argue that prior to the Reagan tax cuts, that CEOs basically they would hit a level of income, and it was roughly the equivalent of $3 million a year in today's dollars. They would hit that, and at that point, their income tax rate would go from 40% to 74%, and they'd say, "Okay, this is all I'm going to take." And it's, you know, for 4 decades, CEO salaries were 30 times what average workers were, and it was not, you know, some magic thing, and it wasn't that CEOs suddenly became sociopathic, and it was, you know, it was that the top tax rate got dropped from 74% to 25% in 1986. And so isn't the simplest solution to income inequality to roll back the Reagan tax cuts?
Well, and instead what you end up seeing is one party of Congress that, largely because of Grover Norquist, feels that tax is a dirty 4-letter word, that they can't even have a real conversation about the revenue that it takes to run this country. And instead it's starving the beast, or trying to drown the government until it's the size of what you can drown in the bathtub. I mean, that's classic Grover Norquist, right?
Yeah, his phrase tomorrow last.
That's what we're seeing. And so the consequences at this point are we now have a nation where the 20 richest people who live in this country hold more wealth than the bottom half of the nation's population combined. 20 people holding more wealth than the bottom half of our population. And instead, you see, again, the Republicans in Congress and Trump joining them, using even pieces of legislation like their repeal of the Affordable Care Act that is currently moving through Congress as vehicles for further enriching the wealthy. That, make no mistake, that piece of legislation has hidden in it $600 billion of tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. If you're one of the top 1/10 of 1% in this country, you would end up taking home $200,000 in a single year just in tax cuts that they're calling health care.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Rebecca Vallas, Managing Director of Poverty and Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress. The new show, or the newly named Off-Kilter podcast. You can find out about it at Off-Kilter Show at Facebook.